Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 61. And today I'm joined for a second time by Shahid Iqbal, this time to chat about platform engineering and infrastructure as code. Now, last time you were on episode 5 where we chatted about Kubernetes, which was 3 years ago. So welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I thought it was a single-digit episode, and yes, it was nice to be one of the early set. The podcast has gone from strength to strength, so congrats. It's awesome to see that.
Oh, thank you.
You've had some amazing guests on as well.
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of, I give the credit to the guest. For me, it's just all the editing work. That's the thing that takes the time, but otherwise it's the guests that do all the amazing work. So for those that don't remember back 3 years ago, could you give the listeners a quick intro into yourself and what you do?
Yeah, I can't remember if I'd moved. I think 3 years ago I hadn't quite moved. So I moved to New Zealand about 2.5 years ago. I'm a principal platform architect at a company called Aura. We're a retail crime intelligence platform. We're based in New Zealand, but we also have offices in the US, Australia, and in the UK now as well. We're a kind of modern SaaS platform, .NET, backend, React, frontend, and Azure hosted. As you know, I'm an Azure MVP, so that kind of makes sense. That's why I ended up there.
Yeah, very nice. I'm very jealous of the New Zealand move, that's for sure. Especially now we're getting into winter.
Yeah, maybe a bit cheeky, but I could do a bit of a sales pitch for any of the audience who wants to come and move to New Zealand, where we've got amazing views and scenery, and the job market's pretty good out here. There's definitely lots of people looking to hire .NET engineers. And it's actually a lot easier to get to New Zealand and live here as a skilled worker than it was when I first started trying to do it just as the pandemic hit, actually. So yeah.
Well, if you want extra persuasion, then go and check out Shahid's, not Twitter, X profile for all the images that he posted of nice sunsets and everything, which kind of does look very nice over there. So before we dig into platform engineering, just a quick reminder that this podcast has its own Discord community. If you head over to the website unhandledexceptionpodcast.com, you'll see a Discord link there. And also a quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company, providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. Okay, so platform engineering. I guess a good place to start really is defining what is meant by this term platform.
Yeah, I think this is probably a bit of a contentious point because I think there's different definitions of it. There's often a comparison with kind of DevOps really, and DevOps was, I guess, just quickly summarize that, kind of tools and practices that combined development and operations, kind of broke down those silos. And platform engineering to some degree feels like another version of that, but in some way centered around cloud native is often mentioned there. And I think often whenever cloud native is mentioned, Kubernetes isn't far behind there. But I would argue that those two aren't, synonymous. They're not the same thing. We are cloud native. We don't use Kubernetes directly in my workplace, for example. So it feels like platform engineering is almost like another attempt. The cynic in me, I've been around for a little while, the cynic in me says that a lot of these terms get hijacked by vendors, and then vendors tend to kind of have their own version of, DevOps in a box, and platform engineering is becoming the same way, really. So in some ways, my take on it is the platform team's job is really to help our feature teams deliver the features. And how that happens really depends on the organization you're at and the size of the organization and the maturity of the organization. So in some organizations, that might be you are working towards some kind of internal developer platform because you're running Kubernetes and you've got people training out microservices and they need somewhere to deploy them, and they don't really need to know that Kubernetes is being used. And then the other end of that spectrum could be that, like we use Azure PaaS a lot. We very consciously don't want to abstract Azure PaaS away from our engineers. We don't want them to not know they're using Azure PaaS. That feels like a bit of a pointless exercise. So in that sense, we're not really creating an internal developer platform. We're just trying to enable our developers to deploy their code and deploy the infrastructure they need for their code in a way that's manageable by them. So that's that kind of spectrum, I guess.
I guess you could say the same almost applies for Kubernetes, where I totally get that if you've got a team managing the Kubernetes clusters and all that kind of stuff, that's kind of almost like a private cloud where you abstract that away and the developers don't need to know the Kubernetes details. But on the flip side, it's quite powerful being able to spin up Kubernetes locally and use it as part of your development workflow. So in a way, just like you're saying that you don't really want Azure PaaS abstracted away from the developers, to a certain level, I don't mean a deep level in Kubernetes. For me, it's quite important that the developers understand the basic concepts of Kubernetes if they're going to use it as a platform. But yeah, totally, it's kind of the details. That is kind of where that you can't have everyone knowing everything to like a very deep level. So you've got to have like some kind of Kubernetes expert if you're using Kubernetes, or like not singular but more plural. So at least one Kubernetes expert in the team that's actually dealing with like actually setting it up, making sure security and networking and all that kind of stuff is set up. Where I think that it's still important for devs to actually understand the basics of whatever air quotes platform you're using, whether it's Kubernetes or Azure PaaS or that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my background, as you might know, I was a software engineer for quite a while, and then I moved across to the dark side, if you like. Whereas a lot of people who inhabit that cloud architecture space have often come from the ops side. But absolutely, I don't think there's any platform that does a perfect job of hiding the underlying implementation. All the abstractions are leaky, so it's a bit of a fool's errand to try and hide that from the developers. And in particular, I think having a core understanding of how these things work was a lot of what I did back in 3 years ago when we had that first conversation, was really just introducing Kubernetes to developers. Actually, it wasn't targeted at ops people. So yeah, I think the trick really is remembering that the silos thing is one of the key aspects that the DevOps practice tried to break down, which was you don't have your code and you throw it over the fence to somebody else to kind of deploy and run. The platform engineering principle that we apply is very similar. We're not a team who then just takes the code and makes it possible to run. Our job is really to help our feature teams own the full stack. That's all the way from the code they're writing, the telemetry they're generating, the alerts they might be using, the deployment pipeline, and then the actual infrastructure. So use it through the infrastructure as code, which I think we'll talk about a bit more in a bit. And then even alerting and maybe support and out of hours support and all of that. So it's that kind of full stack. And, we're on a journey along that way, and others are probably, further along or slightly behind on that journey. But I think that's the key element. Now, do all of our developers or engineers need to be Azure PaaS experts? No, that's not what we're trying to do here. It's giving them enough to own what they've got there and help them make the decision. Which storage account do I use? Do I use a zone redundant one? What's the difference between a zone redundant one and a geo redundant one? But those things are, relatively straightforward once you've used one of the two and you've understood the differences. Then as a developer, you'll generally be able to know what to use next time. And with the infrastructure as code, you will have some of that, in the code, if you like, as well. So you can follow the patterns from there.
I guess it's also from a developer point of view, if you completely just black box it, then some developers might come in and say, well, I want to learn Azure stuff. So it's kind of like if you don't give them the option because the platform team completely own that, devs don't get a chance to do anything in there, then people that want to do that are going to find somewhere else to work as well. So I think it's giving people a choice. Some people might not want to touch it, they just want to write code. Some people might want to learn more of Azure. So it's having that flexibility, I guess. One thing you touched on then was like telemetry and metrics and things. One of the questions I was going to ask was about like the scope of support and various things. So things like if you're using like Grafana or Datadog or something, so the ownership of that, does that fall under the platform engineer role?
So we're adopting OpenTelemetry and Honeycomb, for example. So from our perspective, we've had a project going within the platform engineering team, which was to set up the foundations. So to start doing the initial, adding the telemetry libraries into the code base, setting up some of the infrastructure. So we're using collectors and things like that. Set the foundations in place. And then really our job is now to hand that over to our feature teams. So it's to show our feature teams what the capabilities are, what they can get from the telemetry versus, say, what they were getting from Azure App Insights and things like that. And then help them really. So can be consultants, if you like, internal consultants, as opposed to being the ones who are adding in the correct tracing. I nearly said logging, and Martin, who's I think he's been I'm sure he's been on the podcast, will probably kill me. But yeah, adding the kind of tracing and the spans and everything. That's something we want the feature teams to do. We don't want to own that as a platform engineering team, because that doesn't scale anyway. And again, it's that thing of we creating a barrier or a silo that we don't want to create. So in some ways, you could argue that we have got subject matter experts within the platform team. So I guess specifically the Aura platform engineering team at the moment is comprised of Azure kind of experts, if you like, and then also software engineers, but they're generally the principals of very experienced engineers. So we have a broad remit and a broad spectrum of experience across the full stack, if you like, not just front end and back end, but also the infrastructure as well. So yeah, and I think the trap there is that you have a platform engineering team who just then becomes like the old ops team was, or the siloed team. I don't think we'll have time to get into it, but SRE kind of plays another part of this as well. And we do have an SRE in our team, but again, we are trying to keep it as a foundational team who is helping our feature teams, not necessarily owning everything ourselves.
Yeah. Martin Thwaites has been on the podcast before. I've never actually used Honeycomb. Obviously, he works with Honeycomb, but I use OpenTelemetry as well. But I've not used, I basically throw things to Grafana Cloud. But yeah, so it's the same pattern. So we've got in our clusters like the hotel collectors, which just, as you know, it's a standard, so it can then push out to whatever, whether it's Honeycomb or Grafana Stack or Datadog or whatever. So yeah, it's a really nice pattern. So if we think more about like the old traditional IT folk, like the operations teams and stuff, where's the crossover between like platform engineers and those like non-developer operations people?
Yeah, I don't know if this is controversial, but I think in the modern tech organization, I don't think there's anyone who doesn't have some of the typical software engineer, software developer skills. So in particular, things like scripting, Git, tools like that. I think we can go on Twitter and find somebody. Can I say shit posting? Maybe you can bleep it out. Shit posting about or posting hot takes on a variety of tech topics that generally are off the mark. So yeah, so I think that old ops world that started to break down when DevOps did start becoming adopted, and despite the best efforts of the vendors to sell you DevOps in a box, I think those organizations have recognized what it meant. You didn't necessarily have a DevOps team, you didn't have a DevOps department. There was an office where people went down to and knocked on the door and spoke to the DevOps manager. Well, yeah. So I think that certainly in the last 5 years or so, I think you'd say those barriers have been broken down to some degree. Again, you'll find organizations who have various different levels of, dare I say, maturity. If we want to talk about this being the right way to do it, you could say they're not as mature, but certainly you can imagine in larger enterprises, it's a very different IT arrangement, IT world. And I think even within them, there'll be pockets who are adopting the newer approaches to do things, but it can be generally very difficult to get a large typical enterprise organization moving fully into one of these newer models.
Yeah, I suspect a lot of companies will still have a lot of like servers on-prem and even just managing the computers that staff have. So all that side of things and the networking, and I want to networking mean in the offices, but I suppose a lot of people working remotely as well. So even that's like more cloud-based kind of like security and that kind of thing. Yeah, so I know you wanted to talk about infrastructure as code, and I know you're a big fan of Pulumi, but you did mention there was something that happened recently, and I must have missed that in my newsfeed stuff. So I'd be quite interested to hear what happened. Was it with Terraform?
That's right. Yeah. So this was about August time. So it's been a few months, but it still feels quite recent. There was some controversy. Terraform essentially changed their licensing to a BSL model, which is a non-open source license. So I think that caused quite a lot of community disruption, or I'm trying to find the right word really. It certainly caused a lot of ripples across the community. Now, part of that was not necessarily just the specific change. It was just Terraform has got such a huge community behind it as an infrastructure as code tool, and having the organization that's kind of created it and is backing it make this very sudden change away from open source when it's been fully open source, traditionally open source. Just kind of, I think it shook the foundations a little bit. It kind of really made some folks wonder if they can, dare I say, pull the rug, right? Change something so fundamental that it made people, I think, really reconsider what they were doing with their kind of infrastructure as code. Now, I think to be fair to HashiCorp, the changes wouldn't necessarily have made a huge difference to those people who are kind of end users using it day to day. A lot of the changes were centered around reducing the ability of other organizations to offer a commercial product that competed with HashiCorp. But in reality, I think the reaction from the community was quite strong, and some of that is often down to messaging, right? I think you've got a course on Docker, I know, in Dom Train, and that was not a preset up pitch. I've just contextually relevant conversation, but Docker's had a couple of missteps in the past with their licensing changes and caused similar kind of community. I don't want to say community outrage. That sounds slightly contentious, but community getting a little bit upset, and then often they've had to roll back or re-clarify their words. In fact, that seems to be par for the course for tech companies, right? We've got was it Unity not so long ago doing something quite similar with their licensing changes. But really, what happened there was, I think, as you mentioned, Pulumi. So I've been a big fan of Pulumi since around 2019. I started using Pulumi with some of my smaller customers when I was consulting. And the key thing with Pulumi, and it kind of fits back to the platform engineering conversation, which is Pulumi lets you use general purpose programming languages to do your infrastructure as code programming, whereas Terraform and whether the cloud providers own tools, which is Azure Arm, for example, or CloudFormation, those are generally DSLs. They're often built around JSON. They're essentially JSON that's been modified to include some programming constructs into there because people realize that you needed to do loops when you're creating infrastructure. You need to do conditionals when you're creating infrastructure, because you might want to provision a secondary server in a production environment, but you don't want to do that in a dev test environment, for example. So a lot of those tools, they had this special syntax you needed to learn. And if your day-to-day job was to write Terraform, then that's fine. You'd understand the syntax, you'd learn it, and you'd be familiar with it. But if your job was a feature developer and you had to do some modifications to some infrastructure related to your feature, you would have to learn this, and then you might not touch it again for 6 months. Then you come back to it and you're saying, well, what's this weird incantation do? So for me, when I saw Pulumi and I was like, well, we're writing C# or TypeScript, I was like, well, actually, if my developers are writing that code day in, day out, then for them to write a loop or to write a conditional, they're going to completely understand what the code's doing. The trick is they're not necessarily, they don't know the correct storage account. To go back to that previous example, they won't know what storage account they need to use. But in the syntax, in the help, there'll be an enum that will say, it's a zone redundant or it's geo redundant. And once they've had a conversation with the platform team, say, hey, what's the correct storage account to use here? They can go and make that change in the code themselves.
Where you mentioned that because the developers know C# or TypeScript and stuff, so they could just do it. I think you also mentioned that your platform team was very experienced developers and operations people. Because they're obviously not C# developers, do you find that they've now got to suddenly learn programming when they're used to using something like YAML or something?
Yeah, there's that kind of, I guess if we're going to meet in the middle, then both sides have to work their way in. For our team who aren't regular kind of feature developers, we use TypeScript at Aura. We use TypeScript for our infrastructure as code. The decision between TypeScript and .NET was very marginal. I'm a .NET developer. Well, I used to be a .NET developer, I guess it's probably more accurate to say. But we decided on TypeScript because the Pulumi folks said it was probably the best choice if we, all else being the same. And we do use TypeScript as in our front end. So yes, there's been a case of a bit of learning for our platform engineers to learn TypeScript as well. But it's actually not, we're not doing a huge amount of very complex TypeScript code. It's loops, it's maps, it's conditionals. It's really not massively complex. And then the other aspects are really just source control. And we do a pull request workflow. So when we change our infrastructure, we have a pull request that gets done. And then when that merges, that will actually do the modifications to our infrastructure. So that kind of very developer-centric workflow of making a change in a pull request, having it reviewed and having it merged, again, is this kind of trying to bring the two sides to meet somewhere in the middle. And, it's been really really pleasing to see our engineers doing pull requests, our feature engineers doing pull requests to change. Admittedly, relatively simple changes, like maybe the minimum number of instances of something, but just having that ability, they do a pull request, we review it, we'll merge it, it gets updated in the infrastructure. That's really cool. They're not waiting for someone else to run an update for them or give them access to the platform to run the changes.
Yeah, that's really nice. And presumably with like Pulumi, you can abstract stuff out with like npm or NuGet or whatever. So like, I'm just thinking that if the standard is that, for example, using private link, so private networking, and a developer wants to spin up Azure storage, and maybe in dev and QA environments that it's not geo-redundant or anything, but in production it's geo-redundant, all those kind of decisions, presumably you can abstract that out so the developer just has to call a method saying, create me Azure storage in this environment or something. Can you use NuGet packages or npm packages in that way?
Yeah, so the Pulumi has an ecosystem similar to Terraform did, so with providers for different services. So there's definitely the ability to kind of create abstractions, if you like. So you can do this either through creating a set of resources that are packaged together and essentially follow your kind of defaults. I think there's a delicate balance here because there's an easy trap to fall into where you try and create an abstraction of all of the resources. So let's say you've got an Azure storage account, you try and create MyCorp storage account instead, and you try and abstract that away. I think there's other ways of dealing with that, but yeah, absolutely. You can essentially define standards, if you like, I think is essentially what you're getting at, having a consistent way of doing stuff within your organization. Yeah, the Pulumi has that. And then they also have a kind of safeguard mechanism, which is their way of essentially like a policy. So you can create a policy that prevents you from doing certain things that you shouldn't be doing or enforcing minimum standards. So you can tackle the problem from two ways, really.
Yeah. I was kind of thinking like, because obviously I mentioned private link then, and that has things like DNS zones and the private link object itself, as well as the thing you're trying to create, and you've got to link them together. So there's extra stuff to create where actually you just want to be able to call a method almost saying, create me storage.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've used Azure and probably other cloud services enough to know that you sometimes hit some really weird edge cases where you can't complete the provisioning of this thing you need because the API doesn't quite support it. And you often have to drop down into running scripts or running a PowerShell script or something. And this has been the case with other providers as well. And again, this is one of the things where I think Pulumi clicks with me really well, is because I'm writing general purpose programming language code, I can seamlessly integrate the SDK for Azure, for example. So where something that can't be done through the ARM API, I can do is integrate the Azure SDK into my code and then intermingle the Pulumi code with Azure SDK code. I'll give you a really concrete example. If you provision a Azure Data Lake storage account, you can do that in Pulumi. You can do that in ARM, but you can't create folders. You can't create any folders in that storage account through that mechanism. It's a different management API to do the folders. So if you were doing it through an ARM template, or I think even by Bicep, you can't do that. But we've done that because we've got the Azure SDK. So once we've created the storage account and the storage container, we can pass the credentials seamlessly from the Pulumi code to the Azure SDK code and then run the SDK code that creates the folders for us. So it means that we've got a kind of consistent approach for creating these things. Whereas if you were using these other tools, you could potentially test your Terraform code or your CloudFormation code, but then you've got a separate script, a PowerShell script or something that often then needs a dependency or an executable that's on the host machine where that code is running. So that be a bit pitfall because maybe your CI/CD server doesn't have the Azure CLI installed, for example, or the Azure PowerShell commandlets. So there's this, it just works, and that's what's so great about it. I do sound like, and I know I sound like a massive fanboy, and I need to be a bit careful about it, but it really clicked with me, and I've been a huge fan of it, and I've done a number of kind of conference talks on it. Been using it day in, day out since 2019, and in particular, Aura, we've been using it now for a while. And we still have stuff that isn't in Pulumi as well, so you can coexist. You can have stuff that was previously provisioned through a different mechanism, and then it coexists with your new stuff that you're doing in Pulumi as well, which is quite cool. I think I should just briefly touch on, again, it's not a sales pitch, but I think in response to some of the stuff that happened with Terraform and some of the community deciding they want to move away from Terraform thing. The Plumi did offer, like, I think the ability to convert your Terraform stuff to Plumi as part of a service they offered if people were interested in moving to Plumi. Plumi is also promised, and I guess you take it as much as you can take a promise from any company, that they will remain open source and they're not going to kind of backtrack on that. But take that as much as you want to take with any organization, right? I think history is littered with organizations that have promised things and then have backtracked. But today they've stuck by it. I think those folks who aren't necessarily familiar with Plumi, you can use Plumi as an open source tool. You don't need to pay Plumi a cent to use it. But obviously they have an offering that builds on top of their open source tools, which is what they would prefer you to use, and that's how they get funded. But you don't have to pay Plumi a cent to use the tool. I should say penny, shouldn't I now? It says, until the fact I'm over this side of the world now, I'm talking about cents instead of cents of pennies.
Well, you say it's not a sales pitch. It's working. I quite fancy having it. Like, to be honest, it's one of the few. Like, so I've used Terraform. I use Bicep quite a lot, but I've not used Plumi yet. And it's been on my long list of things to play with for a long time. But yeah, it just sounds interesting. And I like I hadn't thought about the point you made about you can drop down to the SDK. And it's a very good point. So in the same, like, say for example, using Plumi in .NET, because Azure's got an SDK, a management SDK, to do stuff with resources, then you can use both, and it's the same .NET code, which, like, as you say, rather than doing Azure Bicep deploy or whatever the command is, and then having to run something else, then it's all together. And if you're abstracting it into classes and everything to tidy away, then all NuGet packages, it can all be abstracted away. So yeah, that's really nice, actually. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, that's been the magic bit of it. With the credential parsing, in the past that might have been a bit trickier, but you might be familiar with the default Azure credential stuff that's in the later Azure SDKs. That's what we use. So it's super convenient because we're not trying to explicitly pass a connection string around. We are just using, in the SDK, we're using the default Azure credential. Our Plumi code is using managed identity, and they essentially then work using the same identity behind the scenes when they're running in our CI system. So yeah, it's even more seamless than it was a few years ago.
Very nice. I'll have to have a play. So going back to Terraform, I know, like, in our, like, shared notes, you mentioned something which I've not heard about called Open Tofu, which I believe is basically following on from the issue you mentioned, the open source, closed source issue you mentioned before.
That's right. Yeah, when that license change was announced, obviously one of the options the community had was, hey, we can fork, because the license change wasn't retrospective; it was going to apply from the next version. So there was an opportunity there for the community to decide to essentially, should we fork Terraform? Initially, that project was under the kind of banner of OpenTF, and then it's kind of morphed into Open Tofu. I'll be honest, I prefer OpenTF, but yeah, so essentially it's the community's response to that license change, and essentially it's a fork of Terraform. So it'll be interesting to see how that kind of works out. As I said, I've kind of moved on, if you like, from Terraform. I have this arguably controversial slide in my in one of my talks where I show that kind of evolution of humankind. I have the kind of clicking and doing stuff in the portal as the kind of first version of that, the first step. And then generally it's using the cloud's own tools, so the kind of CloudFormation stuff. And then it's kind of Terraform, and then Plumi is the kind of next evolution. That's how I've seen it. As I said, I'm very mindful this is turning into a huge sales pitch for Plumi. I should probably kind of, for full transparency, I don't work for Plumi. I get no. I've been given a swag a couple of times, and I'm on their Pluminaries program, but there's no kind of there's no kickbacks or anything for me talking about it. I'm a enthusiastic user, I think is the way I'd put it.
So I know one thing, like, I didn't like that much with Terraform when I did use it was this whole concept of state, because I kind of liked I'm using Bicep more now, and it's kind of like it's just the state of your code and actually in code, and then there's the state of the environment, and that's it. Where with Terraform, you've also got this other state, and we all know what happens when you've got three sources of truth, merge conflicts. So it's kind of, what does Plumi have state, or does that work more like, how does that work?
Plumi does have state, yeah. That's one of the paid options. If you use their service, they manage the state for you, but you can obviously manage it yourself. Yeah, so I think there's controversies around, what's the right option there. I think I like I didn't have an issue with the Terraform state model. I think some of the challenges around it were keeping that state secret, because often there'd be sensitive information in that state and you needed to ensure it wasn't, just accessible. So with Pulumi, if you're not using their service, you can define a backend that can be like a storage account in a cloud provider or something that where that state's being stored. But it does have that concept of state. And yeah, you're right. I think there is the challenge with the state model is that if you think about what the tool is doing, you write the code in whatever language you're writing. Ultimately, behind the scenes, it builds a dependency graph of resources that it needs to provision. And then it really just calls the CRUD APIs on the cloud or the whatever the target tool that you're provisioning, because it's probably worth just briefly mentioning that Pulumi isn't just for clouds. We use it for our Cloudflare DNS. We use it for lots of other tools as well. So it's ultimately what Pulumi is doing is issuing essentially CRUD commands to those APIs. And then it's using its state to understand what's happened so far. So there's this problem where, those CRUD commands are going to be asynchronous. If you start provisioning a resource and then you kind of cancel Pulumi's process, then Pulumi is kind of totally lost about what's happened. It told Azure to provision let's use something like an APIM instance, which is quite slow. That can take maybe 20 to 40 minutes to provision. You hit Control C, you break out of the Pulumi process. Azure's kind of busy carrying on trying to provision the thing. At this point, Pulumi is kind of slightly confused because it knows that it started asking for a APIM instance and then it doesn't know what's happened anymore. So you can definitely get yourself in a bit of a dare I say a state, a bit of a sorry, that's awful. You can get into a bit of a problem, but it's actually very easy to recover that in Pulumi because you can ask Pulumi to export its state and you can amend the state yourself. But yeah, fundamentally to kind of answer your question, fundamentally it's more the Terraform model of it has state and it manages the state, and that's how it's one of the key differences is how it can understand when your cloud has drifted from what you think it should be and all these other mechanisms that having an external view of your provision resources gives you is this ability to compare what you think it should be versus what it actually is, and then detect any drifts and potentially correct them automatically, or at least highlight that there's a drift.
Yeah, that sounds good. So we are almost out of time. Is there any topics that we haven't covered that you'd like to?
I think I followed the whole kind of infrastructure as code and I guess to some degree the Pulumi story over a number of years. And you often see comments on Twitter. I'm going to keep on calling it Twitter and other places. Often there's an argument about whether it's imperative versus declarative. I don't think we need to necessarily get into that one, given the time. I think if you're a cloud kind of architect or somebody, there's a perspective where you might think, well, if the feature teams can write the infrastructure as code, then am I out of a job, right? Is this automating me out of a job? And I would say 100% no, because your teams are going to need experts to help them understand what the right tools are to use, what the right settings are to set, what the right components. We're sport with choice when it comes to which resource to use in Azure. If you consider running a container in Azure at the moment and you're literally sport for choice, there's 5 or 6 different services. So, I think it helps you with your workload to allow your feature teams to do as much of the stuff that they want to do. It empowers them, makes them happier as well. They can feel like they own what they're running, and then you can focus on all the other things that we're not gonna not have a job to do. There's so many things to work on. So, and the cloud is constantly evolving, so it's not even as if we can stand still. Every service is being replaced or has new versions, new features added to it. So I think giving your feature teams the ability to do some of this stuff themselves is going to be hugely helpful to you as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think it'd be interesting, your diagram you mentioned before with like the evolution. What if we have another chat in another 3 years' time? Then what's happening there is like ChatGPT doing everything for us, or how AI fits into all this. But if we start talking about AI, that would be another episode in its own right, I would imagine.
Yeah, maybe at the risk of further reinforcing the sales pitch thing, that's exactly something Pulumi has on their website. They've got integration with the ChatGPT, so you can ask it to essentially give you the Pulumi code for creating this service. So it's quite cool. We don't necessarily use it for kind of large scale projects, but if somebody's curious about getting started, go to the Pulumi website and you can literally have a play with it there. it's pretty cool, actually.
That sounds really good. So before we wrap up, where's the best place for listeners to reach out to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I still kind of hover around on Twitter. We'll have my Twitter handle, and then also on LinkedIn. Yeah, that's probably the best place to get in touch. I'd be really interested to hear from other teams who are working on platform engineering problems where they're not necessarily using Kubernetes. It'd be good to compare notes, actually. Like, I don't know, we have all the answers. We're still trying to figure things out as well. So
sounds good. And you're now on the podcast Discord as well, if you can get the caption right. I told you I'd throw that in there somewhere.
Thanks, Dan. Yes, I definitely felt like a massive boomer trying to figure out the Discord capture where it was asking what's the biggest animal on the screen. And I didn't know if it meant the size of the image on the screen or whether a zebra was bigger than a dolphin. Anyone who knows the answer to that, please let me know, because I struggled with the capture. So that's why Dan's taking the mickey out of me.
I did say I would bring it up as a laugh at some point in the podcast, and we got near to the end, and I bet you were thinking, "Oh, I've got away with it," and then no.
Fair enough. I deserve it, to be honest. It was a very boomer kind of problem, to be honest.
Well, it is quite late over there, so it's kind of like for me, it's like 10 o'clock in the morning, but I think is it like 10 o'clock in the evening for you, or 11?
11:15 in the evening. Yeah, Friday evening. So yeah.
We'll let you off then. We'll let you off.
Exactly. That's it. That's my excuse.
Cool. Well, yeah, just a massive thank you for joining us again. And next time, let's not leave it 3 years, or even just for a catch up. It's been a while.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let's keep in touch. I'll try and keep on the Discord a bit more than I clearly have done before. Long enough to stop the capture coming up.
Well, it never asked me, so I think it's because maybe you've not been on it for years and it was the first time. But I can't remember the last time it even asked me to log in, to be honest. But yeah, Discord is good. And yeah, so just a reminder to everyone that there is a Discord community for the podcast. And if you go to the website, unhandledexceptionpodcast.com, there's a link there to join. And yeah, thank you to everyone for listening. Just a reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Overstack, which is my own company, providing software development and consultation services. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please do help me spread the word on social media. I normally use the hashtag unhandledexception. I'm on Twitter as well, at Dracan, Dracan. And I would say my DMs are open, but I would rather be DM'd via Discord because that's my go-to place nowadays. And my blog, danclark.com, has links to all my social stuff too. And we'll, as usual, include links to all the stuff we've mentioned in the show notes, which can be found on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com. And there is a comment section at the bottom of each episode.